Today's webinar, titled Evaluating Family Engagement Strategies, Addressing Measurement Challenges, will highlight promising approaches for evaluating these strategies, address challenges in defining and measuring outcomes, and provide guidance for building evaluation into a family engagement plan. At the end of the webinar, we will be addressing questions from the audience. Throughout the webinar, you can enter your questions in the question box on the screen. Simply type your question and then press enter. Please note that we receive several hundred questions during these webinars, and we can only address a limited number. So we won't be able to get to everyone's question. In addition, the webinar is being recorded, and we will send out the archived presentation along with the slides next week. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists. Okay. First, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Heather Weiss. Heather is the founder and director of the Harvard Family Research Project, or HFRP, and is also a senior research associate and lecturer at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. HFRP's mission is to create more effective practices, interventions, and policies to support children's successful development from birth to adulthood. Heather writes, speaks, and advises on programs and policies for children and families, and serves on the advisory boards of many public and private organizations. She is also a consultant and advisor to numerous foundations on strategic grant making and evaluation. Our next panelist is Rebecca Menard, a distinguished scholar and a national leader in education and social policy research. Becca has served as the commissioner for the National Center for Education, Evaluation, and Regional Assistance, or NCEE, since June of 2010. As commissioner, she oversees NCEE, one of the 4 centers in the Institute of Education Sciences at the U.S. Department of Education. Prior to joining the department, Becca served as University Trustee Chair, Professor of Education and Social Policy at the University of Pennsylvania, where for 5 years she directed the university's IES predoctoral training program in education sciences. She helped develop the What Works Clearinghouse, and her work was instrumental in the creation of the Campbell Collaboration, an international association of public policy professionals who work to solve societal problems through scientific research and analysis. Our next panelist, Amy Clark, is a project director at Education Development Center, or EDC, a global nonprofit research organization based in the Boston area. In her 12 years at EDC, Amy has directed numerous projects across EDC's education and health divisions. Her work is tied together by a commitment to shape school and home environments so that more children can succeed in education beyond high school. Amy began her career as a middle grades teacher and brings a practical approach to projects under her leadership, taking care to develop programs and services that meet the needs of students, parents, and school personnel. Our next panelist is Eric Deering, Associate Professor of Applied Developmental Psychology in the Lynch School of Education at Boston College. Eric's research is focused on the ways that connections between families, schools, and community agencies promote the life chances of children growing up poor. The results of his research have been regularly featured in the media, and recently Eric received a Young Scholar Award from the Foundation for Child Development to evaluate City Connects, an intervention that increases community agency involvement in schools to promote the achievement of immigrant children in low-income urban elementary schools. Our next panelist is Kate Gill-Cressley, a senior research associate at RMC Research Corporation. Kate is also an external evaluator for the PERCs in New Hampshire, Utah, and Massachusetts, and a national consultant in the field of family, school, and community engagement, currently working with the Boston Public Schools Office of Family and Student Engagement and the Center on Innovation and Improvement. Kate brings deep experience in evaluation, as well as program planning, implementation, and continuous improvement across the evolving family engagement field. And then lastly, our last panelist is Kathy Hoover Dempsey, Associate Professor of Psychology and Education at Vanderbilt University. Kathy's research focuses on parental involvement in children's and adolescents' education and the influence of family engagement on student learning outcomes. She has developed and evaluated school-based interventions designed to increase the incidence and effectiveness of school and teacher invitations to parental involvement, and has consulted with varied national, state, and research programs designed to enhance the effectiveness of parental involvement and family-school partnerships. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our moderator, Heather Weiss.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to start by extending my welcome and also thanking the panelists who you just heard about, a group of very experienced researchers and evaluators, for joining this roundtable conversation about how we evaluate and evaluation strategies for family engagement. We chose to do this as a roundtable because evaluation and family engagement is an evolving arena, and we thought it would be useful to get experts to talk about some of the strategies as well as specific things like indicators of family engagement at this point in our field's conversation about evaluation. So I'd like to thank them. I'd also like to thank people that sent questions in advance. You'll see some of them in the slide deck. And I would also ask you to hold your questions, write them in, but hold them. We'll be addressing them in the last 20 minutes of the webinar. So we want to have some back and forth with everybody who's participating. I would also like to say that with the webinar, we're trying to create a mind shift from evaluation out there and done to us to in here, done by and for us, to strengthen our learning, our continuous improvement, as well as our accountability and sustainability within family engagement. The field, as this webinar series has indicated and has supported, is shifting from family engagement programs to trying to build in systemic, integrated, and sustained family engagement from early childhood through high school. An example, hypothetical example, but more and more places are beginning to move toward it, is a district that has a assistant superintendent for family engagement and family engagement staff at every school, professional development for family engagement for staff, teachers, and others, a commitment to 100% participation over a period of time in parent-teacher conferences in person or by phone or through some other means, a commitment to sharing data on student performance and school performance regularly with related ways in which families can support their child's development as well as support overall school performance. And finally, things like family academies and other volunteer activities that build family and school capacity for effective family engagement, all directed toward promoting school learning and student achievement. So when we talk about, as we will in the course of the webinar, systemic, integrated, and sustained engagement, that's the kind of vision that the field is driving toward. We've organized the webinar around 4 key questions. First is, why evaluate? And then, what are some promising approaches to evaluation, including strategies that people can use to look at these more systemic, integrated, and sustained efforts? How can evaluation data be put to good use? This is the get it out of the drawer and into action question. And then, what are important evaluation resources, and how can I access them? And with this 4th question, we're going to try to talk about resources in addition to money being important, but some of the other additional resources that can be brought to bear. So moving to the first question, why evaluate? Amy, I know you've recently done some research at EDC looking at district family engagement and efforts to evaluate them. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd love to. Yeah, in 2009, EDC wrapped up a study that we did to collect information about what family engagement practices were being used at the middle and high school levels. And we looked specifically at urban districts in the Northeast region of the country. Because this study was conducted under the auspices of EDC's Regional Education Lab for the Northeastern Islands. So this study was actually a response to specific requests that we received from education leaders in our region for a more systematic way to collect information about how schools were working with parents. So we designed the study to find out what schools were doing to engage families, and also to ask which of their strategies that they were using had been evaluated to determine their effectiveness. And our ultimate goal was to produce a catalog of strategies that had some evaluation data behind them, and we hope that at least some of the evaluations that we would find had happened would meet the Department of Education's definitions of rigor. So while we found that schools were using numerous and diverse practices for engaging families, very few of these had been evaluated, either formally or informally. And taken as a whole, they also, per school, each school had many strategies, many practices that they had going on. At each school, though, when you looked at the sort of whole of the practices that were happening, there wasn't often a coherence or a unifying thread to tie all those together. And similarly, we found that, save for a few exceptions, there was little written documentation of what schools did to work with families from year to year. And in general, when schools were making decisions about what to do to engage families, their choices were guided more by the oral histories that were kept among the staff and teachers, rather than by the data collected through monitoring and evaluation, which actually brought us back to the concern that kicked off the study in the first place, and that is, what are the mechanisms that we have in the region for sharing what schools are doing to reach families, and what strategies are working. So,
thank you. This kind of, I think, paints a picture of kind of where we are in some ways, in the sense that many schools have a set of practices but not a strategy. We don't have a lot of evaluation in place even of the practices. So it kind of paints a picture, I think, of where we are. Now I'd like to, with that backdrop, talk about, in light of that, what are some of the goals for evaluation? Why evaluate? And ask some of our other panelists to speak to that.
This is Kathy. I think primarily one of the goals of evaluations that's critical is to begin to find out what is working, why it's working, and what we might do in future years to continue its effective functioning. I think without that effective evaluation, it becomes very, very difficult to, as both of you have suggested, given that I've just joined the conversation, it becomes very, very difficult to see any continuity moving from year to year.
Other thoughts? Go ahead.
This is Becca. I just want to say that I also think it's really important to think about evaluation as something that can also help us improve practice. Sometimes some of the things that we do, whether it's the overall strategy or sub-activities within a strategy, aren't working quite as well as they should. And the evaluations can be very powerful in helping to understand why ideas that we thought were good aren't playing out in practice as well as we thought they were. So I think there are reasons to find things that are effective, and also reasons to find things that aren't working well, and to try to understand why and how to either get around it or fix it.
So in some ways, the conversation that I'm hearing is that we have a mindset for evaluation that says, in an ongoing way, we're going to be looking at what we're doing, and we'll be celebrating and sharing some of the things that the evidence suggests works. But we will also expect that some things won't work, and that's par for the course, and that part of the value of the evaluation is to surface those things so we can make another pass at it. Is that a fair sense of it?
Yes.
And I think another aspect of it, and I like, Heather, the way you introduced the notion of evaluation being something that we do and not something that's done to someone, that it's a collaborative effort. Another aspect is that we are accountable, and the field of family engagement is a serious field, and serious things get measured because they matter. So I think that when we focus on evaluation in this field, we underscore the importance of this field and what it contributes to the broader field of education and student learning.
Great. Now, I want to turn to the myths. I know in our conversation as a panel prior to the webinar, we talked about there is a set of myths that surround evaluation. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of those. Some of them to tee up Some of them are, it costs too much, we don't have the expertise. What are some of the other myths that our panel sees out there as barriers to evaluation?
I think one thing is, I'm sorry, this is Kathy. I think one thing that's often a barrier is school district assumptions that it's just going to be too difficult to do the evaluation, that the time, energy, and resources, as you've said, are not going to be available.
Okay.
This is Eric. I would also add that I'm not sure if this is a myth as much as it is a fear. I think there's a fear around finding out something you don't want to know. And I think that fear is misplaced or misguided, in that going back to Rebecca's comments around why we should be evaluating, those are opportunities and moments when, and as you mentioned, Heather, when things aren't going the ways we expected them to go, to redirect and reevaluate our goals and our methods and approaches to family engagement, and or the ways that we're measuring family engagement and the results of it. So.
Anybody else want to add anything else?
And I'd just add one thing. This is Kathy. That one of the things I've experienced sometimes in schools is an appreciation for the fact that I and folks who are coming with me talk like regular people, and I think sometimes there's an assumption in schools that people who do evaluation aren't going to connect with them, aren't going to understand what they're really doing, and will leave them out there kind of flailing, particularly, as Eric said, if some of the results suggest that the program or the efforts aren't being successful.
And this is Kate, and I want to piggyback on what Kathy just said, because as a program person and an evaluator, I know that at times I might have the fear as a program person that the program implementation has not unfolded exactly as you had predicted it to unfold, and therefore, the evaluator is going to come down on you, so to speak. So, the importance of working collaboratively with the evaluator in the beginning with the planning, and then, that ongoing communication as the program implementation unfolds is critical, so that you don't have those misperceptions.
I'm interested to turn now. We've talked about some of the issues, the resource issues, the fear of negative findings when the evaluator doesn't seem to be lined up in a collaboration with the program, et cetera. I'd be interested in people's sense of what makes evaluation a win-win situation. In other words, if you had to lay out a couple of things that are really necessary for an evaluation to go well, what would you put on the table?
This is Becca, and my experience is that the most important thing in doing a good evaluation is to design it in a way that it is everybody gains from the knowledge, regardless of whether the results come out showing the program to be highly successful or whether it comes out showing it to be neutral or a disaster. And to do that, what you really need to do is the evaluator has to work hand in glove with the program staff to understand what the program is trying to accomplish, how it's going about accomplishing that, what the issues are that are important to the program, something about the constraints. You also need to think about how to judge when the program or strategies within the program are being effective or not effective, and design a strategy that's going to address multiple questions that are of interest to multiple audiences. So program people need to feel that at the end of the day, they're going to have information that will help them do a better job in achieving the objectives that they have dedicated their careers to. And if that means changing how they're doing their jobs or what they're doing in their jobs, to me, that's something program people are welcome. What they don't welcome is evaluators coming in and saying, you're a winner and you're a loser. And that's all I'm going to tell you.
That's critically important, I think. This is Kathy. I would just say that what Becca has just suggested also suggests strongly that in evaluation we practice what we preach about parental engagement, and that is families and schools must be in a collaborative relationship if students are going to learn as well as they can. And it seems to me that Becca's really urging that same collaborative relationship between evaluators and school systems, which means people from both parts of the equation are going to be seeing each other, talking with each other, and understanding what's going on in the world of the school and the world of the evaluator.
So let me press this one more level, and that's what I'm hearing is the importance of this collaborative relationship. But in addition, I think the regular flow of information back and forth, with the implication that if things are not going well, I'm not going to hear it at the end of the evaluation. I'm going to be hearing some of the information about it in the course of the work. Is that a fair statement about what I'm hearing?
Yes.
Yes.
So that then assumes that the time and commitment is in place on the part of all parties to make it work in an ongoing way. So it's not evaluation done to us, but done with us, with everybody committed to that over time. So that I know as a program person, I'm going to be getting things about how we're doing and an opportunity to improve them as we go, as well as perhaps information at the end that suggests there's some additional things I need to be working on. Is that a fair sort of summary? And if those things are in place, we think we have a win-win situation?
I would like to add one more thing that I think is important to put in place. I think it's important when evaluators go into study programs and when programs agree to be evaluated, I think there needs to be some acknowledgement that there's an overlap in the missions and the interests of these two groups, but there are some things that the evaluator has to protect in terms of the integrity of what's being done, and there are some things the program people have to protect. So when I go in to evaluate a program, I can't ask a program to turn what they're doing upside down so that I can study them in a way that's comfortable for me. I have to figure out how to do a good evaluation in a way that allows that program to operate as it is intended to operate. So there's some negotiation that needs to go on. So I enter into an evaluation design phase with the understanding that that we're going to have to do some back and forth in terms of figuring out what the objectives of the evaluation are, then how I can do a good evaluation without being overly burdensome to the program people. That takes some trust because I'm going to have to try out some ideas, some of which may not work. The program people have to honestly tell me, which of those things are going to cause problems, and we need to negotiate on that. So there are some things that only the program people can control or should control. Some things only the evaluators should control, and there's a big area in the middle where they should negotiate.
Excellent. Anyone else want to add anything?
This is Kate. I think in terms of working well in a win-win situation, it's important to build in enough time at the beginning so that the evaluation planning can really be comprehensive, and the work starts with good understandings both on the program implementer's part and the evaluator's part, and also that the evaluator needs to be engaging those folks so that their important questions are heard in terms of what they want to see be evaluated. And again, as was just stated, then there's an important area of negotiation and shaping those questions and staging them up perhaps so that needs could be met for information.
Excellent. Okay, I'd like to move to our second guiding question about promising ways to approach evaluation. And when we thought about this, one of the things that I think is very important, is the good old logic model to guide the development of an evaluation strategy. And I was reminded of back in the 1960s when we were just beginning to do large-scale evaluations of federal demonstration projects. They developed something called evaluability assessment. And in some ways, a logic model is an extension of that. It really is a tool that helps to develop a program, but then a related evaluation strategy. We have, in a set of resources that will be posted after the webinar early next week, some examples of logic models, including one of a fairly comprehensive district family engagement effort. So I bring it to the conversation here just to say that I think most evaluations would be wise to develop and/or convene around a logic model that helps to develop an evaluation strategy. And many, I think, in the webinar audience know about logic models. They are graphics that represent what your program hopes to achieve, what it's doing, and what the anticipated impacts are on the target population and the community. And we see them often in use as and operating as aids to strategic program planning and development, so that everybody's on the same page about what you're trying to do, how you're going to achieve it, and then to develop the indicators of whether or not you are achieving it. I think of this as a back-of-the-envelope exercise that then gets formalized into a logic model, but as we've used it at HFRP, we see it as the place where issues, for example, of dosage come up. You do a logic model and you say, we're going to have a math night, and then the outcome is that kids are going to improve in math. When you go back and forth between those inputs and outcomes, you realize one math night is probably not going to lead to that kind of an outcome, and you either start thinking about increasing your dosage or changing your outcome. So it has that program planning aspect to it. In addition, they promote evaluation planning and can support the kind of process of continuous learning and improvement that the panelists have articulated up to this point in our conversation. So they help you identify the logical linkages between the inputs and outcomes, and then identify indicators of progress toward those outcomes. And I think equally importantly, distinguish between measures of effort and measures of effect. And in the examination we did of audience questions that were submitted to us prior to the webinar, one of the key ones was this one about fusion between the inputs and the outcomes. So I want to ask the panel to clarify a little bit about that. How can we move from evaluating our reach, the number of people we reached with a piece of material or whatever, to actually evaluating the impact of the program services? The panelists have suggestions with respect to this?
Well, I think this is Eric, and step back a little bit. I think to add together what you said about the way that a logic model should be, given best practice, guiding program development, and then in turn guiding evaluation. From the evaluation side, it's really going to be giving insight into what, when, and how, and why we should be measuring. And to just give another example, you gave the dosage example. I mean, something else is when we're talking about children, we have development, maturation, things take time. And a program implemented on Monday that expects to see differences in student achievement on Tuesday is in trouble, of course. And the logic model should be informing us, given an underlying theory of change, how much time and what's reasonable to expect when. And with reasonable expectations, we can get more excited about that process of change over time as it unfolds. With unreasonable expectations, we can get into trouble really quickly. So I would just add that.
This is Kate, and I want to extend what Eric was saying just minutes ago, because I think that the audience question, as we have it posted, I want to comment on that because I think that it's not that we can shift to measuring the latter without still doing the former. And by that I mean not just counting how many people take part in certain activities, but really understanding the nature of those activities and also understanding from a programmatic basis what actually gets done. And that, that goes into the measuring of, as Heather mentioned, the dosage, or measuring, what is the intervention, what is the opportunity for parents to learn or families to learn, and to make sure that all of those things are in place first in order to have something to measure. So it's really it's still two parts. We have to be able to document what we've done well enough so that we know that there is a logical link between what we've done and the outcome impacts that we have identified according to certain indicators.
And this, that gets me and I think, and gets us to the conversation about indicators and identifying indicators of progress. And I know, Kathy, you have, and other people have built off some of the work you've done on indicators, and I know, Eric, you've thought a bit about that as well as other people on the panel. Would you talk to us a little bit about some of the short-term and long-term indicators, how we go about developing them as part of our evaluation efforts?
Yes, this is Kathy. I would like to jump in just to reemphasize the importance of a point that Eric was making a bit ago, too. When we're evaluating increases or improvements in parents' involvement, and when we're evaluating the influence of parents' involvement activities, or in our terms, their engagement of varied learning mechanisms in helping their children with schooling, we're talking about longer term rather than shorter term processes. Parents learn many of these skills slowly and over time. Children certainly will take some time to manifest the positive benefits of what their parents are supporting in their learning. So just really want to say that we need to look not so much at really flash in the pan, in and out evaluation, but evaluation and programming with necessary changes as indicated by ongoing evidence across time. In terms of the indicators in the work that we have done, there are indicators in terms of what we think motivates parents' involvement, and those I think can be very helpful if a school's or a school district's focus is on engaging more parents more effectively in supportive activities related to their kids' schooling. But let me go to the indicators of student learning that we have proposed and looked at then to some extent in our research. What we've suggested fundamentally is that parents' involvement activities reflect that there are many ways in which parents can be involved. Let me put it that way. They can encourage, they can state their expectations, they can model learning activities, they can reinforce what their children are doing that's positive. They can provide, if they feel equipped themselves, some levels of instruction and reinforcement for what's going on. But within the context of those specific activities, they are engaging certain kinds of learning mechanisms, which I just included in that too. So to some extent, what we're looking at here is parents' activities, but what parents are doing in the context of those activities that actually contributes to student learning. And what we've suggested very strongly is that the best estimate of parents' involvement effectiveness is to be found not in a direct relationship with their summary annual measures of achievement, but rather in students' development of what we've called proximal achievement goals. And that is, for example, students' achievement of a greater level of academic self-efficacy, thinking that, yeah, I can do this work. Students' movement toward a sense that, gee, this is interesting. I'm doing it not just because Mr. Jones told me I had to, but because, yeah, it's pretty cool. Achievement goals in the sense of becoming more self-regulated. That is, understanding when I have a question and I need to stop and ask somebody instead of sitting here and twiddling my thumbs and spinning off into some other space because I can't figure it out and I don't know what to do next. And then children's kind of proximal achievement outcomes like learning how to ask good questions of a teacher, learning that you should ask questions of the teacher or a teacher's aide or someone in the daycare setting who is an adult who may be able to help. So those different kinds of indicators, which I believe Heather has put together in one of the slides that we're using today, but it hasn't come yet. Those, I think, are the outcomes, kind of the proximal outcomes that we need to be evaluating, as we also then include evaluations of that longer-term outcome, how kids are performing on achievement tests.
Yeah, I'll just,
go ahead, Eric.
I'm sorry. I was just going to add, I think that just to build on what Kathy has mentioned, that in terms of some of those things we are looking for are attitudes and feelings, both within children and parents, motivation and effort, and just a couple others that I don't think came up yet, but teacher-child relationships are also something we should see in terms of, as Kathy mentioned, proximal processes that should unfold, as well as how, and this harkens back to Kate's point about we don't want to just stop counting some things in order to shift towards this other, but we want to keep counting, where are families dedicating their time and their investments in children, and how are they spending their time? Those should be, as we look at the short-term outcomes, so to speak. Those are some areas that seem to be commonly demonstrated in the research.
This is Heather, and I want to chime in myself here to say that on the resource list, there's a paper by Jim Connell and Michelle Gambone done a number of years ago in the youth development arena that I think can be brought to bear here. They looked at the literature on child development and said young people who have a certain set of supports and opportunities when they get into their early 20s are doing better than those that don't have those supports and opportunities. They then tested that model with existing longitudinal data and found out that, in fact, it was borne out. And I think one of the challenges for us in the family engagement space is to begin to do the equivalent thing here, really look at what we know from developmental research about the specific things, some of which we've just talked about, that parents do that create a pathway that then leads to better learning outcomes for kids. So part of our challenge, I think, is to begin to develop those kinds of models and those pathways to understand some of those proximal indicators that then put you on the route to some of the longer-term improvements in kids' learning and development. I also want to now move to our next question, which I think is a very important one and one that we struggle with in the family engagement arena, and that's the whole notion of the gold standard or experimental research design, random control trials, however we want to label them. Look at their role, and the question that came from one of our members of the audience, what information is lost or gained when we have these RCTs? So I'd ask the panelists to talk about RCTs, their value added, and then really talk about, what do we lose if that's all we focus on. Becca, I know you have some thoughts on that. Would you share it?
Sure. RCTs is something that has gotten a bad name with program people for good reason. So, and that is that I think we have done, we have as a community, evaluators have often been much too rigid in textbook when you go out to do an experimental design study. The reason to do an experimental design study, by which we just mean you have two equivalent groups, one group getting the programming services and another equivalent group not getting the services, is the single best, most defensible way to come up with a really good answer to the question, am I making a difference? In whatever domain you want to look at. It could be, am I making a difference in some of these proximal measures that we just talked about? Am I making a difference in the long-term success of students? The myth is that experiments are, one myth is that they're unethical because we're denying services. Another is that they're expensive. And in both cases, you can do an experiment in a way that's unethical. You can also oftentimes do this in ways that are extremely ethical. I would say in this area, we are resource poor. We don't have enough resources to devote to these kinds of family support services to help students. So one strategy, if we want to defend this turf and get more resources for this area, it is, I would argue, important in this world of scarcity and increasing scarcity to find ways to produce highly reliable evidence that investing in this area is better than investing in some other area, or that it's at least a good investment. And at the same time, another myth is that that's all you learn from an experiment. That may be all you learn from an experiment, is how effective is the program. But if it's designed well, you learn a whole lot more. You learn about what went into operating the program, what aspects of the program seem to work well according to the logic model, what things didn't work well, and maybe why, and how you might make them work better. And so there's a lot you can learn. Experiments also can be quite low cost, and oftentimes it is less costly to do a good experiment than it is to do the best quasi-experiment you can do, which is never as good as a good experiment. So all of this is to say that I would encourage people to work with evaluators to find ways to get these highly defensible answers to the questions of effectiveness in ways that aren't upending your program and that return more than the bottom line answer to whether or not this program is making a difference for long-term outcomes for children.
Becca, I know some people in our webinar audience may not know what an experiment or an RCT is. Could you give us a one-sentence definition?
Yes, this would be a situation where you would offer your family engagement services in some settings but not in others. So maybe, and you would decide which settings, let's say which schools to service. You would determine that by lottery, so that it's just pure chance whether a school is getting the services or not getting the services. So if you could serve, if your resources would allow you to serve 10 schools, you flip the coin among the 30 schools in your district and pick the 10 that are going to get serviced by a lottery, as opposed to picking the 10 in some other way, like all the ones on the east side of town, or all the ones with low test scores, whatever. Or in other cases, if you're doing a targeted outreach kind of program, you might randomly assign neighborhoods, or you might randomly assign individuals. But it is flipping the coin, using lottery to decide who's going to get the services and who's not.
And the argument then is that if you do that, you have the strongest evidence that what you did caused a change.
Well, yes, any differences between your groups then are due to the program or chance. And the larger, if you have a reasonably sized sample, there's a pretty high certainty, and we can determine how certain you are that the differences.
Pardon the interruption, Todd. Pardon the interruption, Todd. This is the operator. Pardon the interruption,
yes.
Todd. This is the operator.
Yes, we can hear you.
Oh, I do apologize. We're having some participants dialing in that I guess just recently, I think there was 4 of them that mentioned that the audio part through the web or the online presentation is bad, and that's why we're having some dialing in.
Okay, we're working on it.
Just wanted to give you guys a heads up.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome. I'll go ahead and join you back.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
for people to be thinking about as we think about sort of our evaluation designs. At the same time, we're at a point in time when people are trying to also focus on innovation and developing new things and testing new things because we don't always have evidence on things that solve the problems we're trying to solve at the moment. So there can be a tension between using evidence from RCTs and innovation, but even with that, I think the innovations then can tee up as they get their feet on the ground more rigorous evaluation designs to test their contribution, if you will. So this is an area I think where there's a lot of different points of view, but and I think good arguments to be had by a variety of people. But I notice increasingly that more and more public policy decisions are being made on the basis of your research design. So I just throw that out for people to be thinking about. The third kind of thing we wanted to focus on is now that we've got we've talked about evaluation, we've talked about some of the purposes. How can we put evaluation data to good use? And earlier in the conversation, we talked about trying to use it to support learning and continuous improvement, as well as accountability and sustainability. And we, as well as many other people, have put together diagrams like the one you see on the screen now that really are designed to position evaluation, ongoing evaluation, and performance management as part of a continuous learning and improvement system. And it really does, as Becca said early on in the conversation, engage the stakeholders in the strategic planning, setting the learning agenda and the performance goals and measures, and building the logic model. What's your theory of change for what you're trying to do is a key part of this process as well. And learning from experience and other relevant research and building that into the program design. And then engaging in the innovation and monitoring the evaluation, developing the indicators. Are we on track? Are we achieving what we think we are? Learning from that, as well as comparisons with others. The family engagement field is rich with lots of different examples, and I think we have real opportunities now to begin to do comparisons across programs, particularly to the extent that we can get evaluation data. We can bring that in to benchmark with others in our field and use those comparisons to support our own improvement. And then the fifth part of this is really transferring the lessons for those course corrections, the program respecification, and this cycle continues. So I put this out because my sense is now that good nonprofit programs and increasingly public programs are building this kind of continuous learning in to the definition of who they are and what they do. So they're moving from one hit, small evaluation here and there, to a more systemic effort to build in data collection, performance management, and evaluation into the core of what they do. And in private philanthropy, they now expect, many of them, that you have this capacity and will be looking at your organization's capacity to do this kind of continuous learning as part of their due diligence to decide whether to fund what you're doing or not. So I put it out because I think our conversation has been driving toward this kind of notion of use of evaluation as part of a learning system. Do other panelists have thoughts about this? Have you seen it in operation? And do you have a sense of what the incentives are for people to transition to this kind of a placement of evaluation?
This is Kathy, and the one thought I had is, as you were saying that, is that in many ways I think the adoption of this kind of a continuous learning system that you've shared with us, to ask a local district or a local school to begin to improve this, I think, without engaging the explicit, enthusiastic support of the state education agency and the district as a whole and the school principal, is sometimes just very, very difficult. I see folks in schools really being buffeted about with this perceived request from somebody and that request from somebody over there and that request from somebody over there, and really looking for some kind of leadership around how do we prioritize? How do we begin to understand what's most important to do here? And I think at the level of teachers working in classrooms in schools, the principal is the person folks look to for that. If the principal is providing that leadership and it's sound and it moves along with an understanding of the kinds of tools we've identified here, I think you can get good support in schools. But if the principal is not moving along with these, and if there is no district or state support for the principal to begin then to kind of come around and understand that this is really important, I see this as just a very difficult task for individuals and schools to kind of take on their own. Mm-hmm. And I know that's not what you're suggesting folks should do, but I really wanted to underscore the importance, I think, of having state and district folks very much committed to supporting principals of individual schools in engaging in this kind of planning and evaluation, and making space for it in the context of what the school and the school's teachers are expected to do on a daily basis.
And this is Kate, and I would even extend that example, Kathy, to the not-for-profit world in terms of those folks who are out working in community-based organizations. If that agency head doesn't have the support and the the resources from his or her board and the funder, and that too undermines the possibility that the agency is going to be in a continuous learning system. And United Way, I think, as a national organization, has gone a long way in the last decade in terms of helping everyone understand the importance of accountability and the importance of really distinguishing between counts and impacts or outcomes.
Yes.
And really moving us forward in that arena.
Amy, I know you began our conversation with what you had found in districts in the Northeast region. When you reflect on this kind of thing and your experience in the research you did, do you see incentives for districts to begin to move in this direction? And do you see critical things? We've identified leadership, I think, and resources as two things that are going to be important for this kind of thing to happen. So do you see incentives for people to move in this direction, and do you have ideas about, what needs to be in place for them to do so?
I think the place where we saw there was sort of this built-in, as you say, incentive or inclination to really pay attention to evaluation was when the family engagement goals were tied to, say, the school improvement plan or the district improvement plan. And when that was the case, the accountability was obviously there, and there was an understanding. It was articulated to either the whole school or the whole district that this was a priority. And once that's done, then you really see a lot more is happening in terms of documenting and monitoring what the schools and districts are doing.
Becca, you are at IES, which has responsibility for I think some of the development of longitudinal data systems and the rest of it. Do you have any thoughts on this?
Well, I have a couple of thoughts. I mean, one is that in my experience, one of the best ways to get buy-in from school districts, principals, superintendents, is to make sure that the evaluation is designed to address short-term concerns as well as long-term concerns. So that's a strategy in how you design what it is that you're going to do. But another strategy is also to capitalize on what is already being done. So you mentioned longitudinal data systems, and we have a major initiative in this country to promote both the creation of longitudinal data systems and to make better use of those data. We don't want to just create those data. In fact, if we just create them, they will not be good data sets if there isn't also some practical use for them. Having those data sets out there means that a lot of the outcomes that one needs to address the ultimate questions, the long-term questions of student achievement gains, attendance gains, and things like that, can be monitored quite inexpensively and quite routinely. And by setting up, for example, a monitoring system, a tracking system as part of an evaluation, you might also be setting up a tracking system that would be useful to the school district and the school independent of the evaluation. So that's a give back. So you're giving back something to the school that has nothing to do, or it's not directly related to the evaluation of your family engagement program, but it is something you need to do that evaluation to do it well. And so a quid pro quo is using the data that are already being collected, and a give back is leaving behind some reporting that could be used for purposes other than monitoring your evaluation.
That's a great example. Before we move on to the last question, I want to also talk about the value of combining implementation data and stories with other kinds of data to communicate about work. And we put up one resource which will be available on this slide in the aftermath from Free Range Thinking, Andy Goodman's work that talks about the importance of stories as well as numbers in moving people and supporting the value of what you do. I also want to point to work that we alluded to in an earlier slide by Ron Murr and Zena Rudo. Ron is an independent consultant. Zena works with CETL. And they've done some nice work for the PERCs on telling the story of your project. And that resource will also be available on our resource list. So we've addressed the question of how can schools and districts use evaluation data to some extent. I now want to turn to how you get the resources to do evaluation. Really, what are important evaluation resources and how can we access them? The conversation of our webinar experts prior to the webinar, we talked about trying to broaden the notion of what are resources beyond funding. Funding is, we know that's necessary. But what are some other kinds of things that we could leverage in order to be able to support evaluation in this kind of continuous learning? So I'd like to open it up to the panelists to give us some examples of expertise, existing data, partners for evaluation, things you're aware of that can be leveraged to support evaluation.
This is Kathy. We've been really successful in all respects. I mean, it's just been very productive relationships to offer, we'll help you address some of the issues that you're trying to deal with here if you'll let us in, so to speak, to get information that's going to be helpful to you in addressing some of these problems. So I would encourage the importance of that.
So this is partly around, I know, Eric, you're in a university setting. Becca, you've been in one. Kathy, you're in one. So this is really trying to figure out how one creates partnerships with higher education. Do people have additional thoughts on that?
This is Becca, and I can just give you a few examples of things that I've done. I have taught courses where I look for practical applied research projects that we can do for a real client so I'll bring a team of 5 to 10 students out to a project site, and you get a faculty advisor and you get some free labor. I've done this negotiating up front what it is that, I don't go in and say, I'd like to do this study. I go in and say, I've got a group of students, we need a project of this duration, here are the kinds of things we can do, what would be useful? So I would argue that there were people like me sitting in universities who have some, who would benefit from having an opportunity to do some evaluation. There just are people in university settings who can not only do these kinds of evaluations, but who can also secure funding for these kinds of evaluations through working with the program people, working with foundations or federal government. We here at IES have research and development programs where we fund studies that would be, fall into the category we're talking about here. There are, well, those are the things I would say that pertain to higher ed. There are some other things we could do that I'll put off until we hear other ideas from the higher ed.
I'm interested, Becca, you had mentioned, and other people may have thoughts about this as well, about using existing data. Do people see ways and, additional ways in which we can do that, because that's a resource?
I would like to jump in here. This is Kate. And I want to take us back to the hypothetical district-level example that Heather sketched. And if you recall, when Heather was describing what that district was working towards, there were some very concrete data points that a district would already have in terms of their normal data collection processes. For example, attendance is a huge factor that's linked to student achievement, especially but not exclusively in middle and high school. The percentage of parents, across schools and grade levels, et cetera, that attend parent-teacher conferences is another kind of data that districts typically would employ. Data on disciplinary actions, for example, is another example of existing data that could be used in the context of a comprehensive program around family engagement that was going on. So I think that, and then finally, many schools are engaged routinely, or they're beginning to engage routinely in surveys of their students as well as faculty and families, and they're looking at issues around school climate. They're looking at issues around homeschool communication, satisfaction, and those surveys could be accessed and perhaps even amended over time so that the questions could get sharper and crisper in terms of connecting survey data with the kinds of interventions that comprise a systematic program of family engagement.
Heather, I'll just add to that and link up with our earlier conversation about having both proximal outcomes and more distal outcomes. Both of these, at least in Boston Public Schools and the elementary schools, are accessible using existing data that the district collects on every child. So, in the distal outcomes, you have things like the standardized achievement test scores. But proximally, included in children's report card grades, teachers in the elementary schools grade children on their effort, work habits, and on their behavior in the classroom. So some of the things that we talked about where we should start seeing short-term outcomes as well, these can be cheaply evaluated as well, and so it's there's a lot of interesting opportunities within existing data that districts collect.
I want to leave time for back and forth with the webinar audience. Do people have final thoughts on resources? I know, Becca, you mentioned some other potential ones. Do other people have final thoughts on it before we turn to our webinar audience?
I would add one thing that's not a resource per se, but it links back to the myths and fears, and as someone's thinking about, do they have the resources to carry out an evaluation? I think that oftentimes programs can get concerned over implementation problems, where problems I'm putting in quotations here. As things slowly roll out, or as there's iterative buy-in, so that things don't happen all at one time, or if you are in a high-poverty urban district, student mobility is rampant and can appear to be problematic. But many of these things are school closings in this economic climate. Many of these perceived problems from an implementation standpoint can oftentimes be evaluation opportunities. And so going back to Becca's point about randomization and controlled trials, oftentimes natural experiments end up unfolding due to what we initially saw as being problems or natural quasi-experiments. And so I just wanted to encourage people to not be discouraged when implementation doesn't go the direction they think it's going to, because sometimes evaluators can be quite happy about that.
Mm-hmm. And this is Kate again. I just want to step back and add one more comment to this slide. I think right now the umbrella question for perhaps a lot of the audience is how can I secure resources for family engagement, period. And what I'd like to say is that when you're out there struggling for resources for family engagement, and you're successful, make sure that proportionally some of those resources are dedicated to evaluation, because evaluation is going to help you sustain those precious resources, help you make the case for accountability and continuation. So there's a proportional formula here. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we've got a big issue around attaining resources for family engagement.
Okay. Thank you. I want to segue now to talk about some of the questions that are coming in from the webinar audience. And one of them is, what role can families and young people themselves play in evaluating family engagement?
This is Kathy. I think one very important role is that families and students should be involved in offering data to program planners and those who are implementing the program. I think sometimes we tend to look at if we understand what school principals, school faculty are thinking about this, then we can know what's going on. And if we look at the big external indicators, the students' grades or students' attendance or students' achievement results, we can know what we need to know here. I think often, though, parents' responses and students' responses, particularly when you are evaluating programs that involve students who are middle school and above, I think what parents and students are perceiving can become a very important part of, A, the data we need to collect, and B, our capacity for understanding how, why, and under what circumstances is this program being successful.
Other people, go ahead.
I was going to say, this is Beth. I was going to say that parents and students are also the targets of these interventions, and oftentimes the targets aren't actively engaged in what we're trying to in the programs we're trying to offer for them, and too often evaluations focus only on those who get in the door. So I would say one of the biggest givebacks for a program from a good evaluation is that you will learn something about who you're reaching and who you're not reaching, and why you're not reaching the people that are out there.
Maybe.
Yeah, and I would say that in some studies that I've done with school districts on things like after-school programs, that's been one of the biggest givebacks from the evaluation for the schools, is that practical information. They would claim they were reaching everybody they thought they were, but when we really dug into it, we learned a lot about who they were not reaching and why they weren't reaching them, and some of what we learned was very easy to fix. People just didn't know it.
Mm-hmm.
Another question that's come in is, are there rubrics or standards that have been developed to measure family engagement and family-school partnerships? Are people aware of rubrics people can use?
Yes. I mean, I think that that the National PTA has done a very comprehensive job in constructing a set of standards with accompanying rubrics. We have examples of school districts, some of whom have taken those PTA standards and then adapted them for their own context, their own schools. Boston is one of those. Kentucky has a set of standards that they have developed as a state. Maryland has a set of standards. Massachusetts is working on ratifying a set of standards for the state. So the work really has come, it's moved forward rapidly. And I think that those standards are especially useful when you're trying to work systemically with schools, because educators and educational leaders understand standards. You're talking their language, so to speak, and it helps them frame the work and understand the benchmarks that they're trying to achieve.
Are there examples that anyone's aware of, Kate, or anyone else, where we've gone beyond standards to then link them to indicators, and people have begun to, track the data with respect to those indicators? So have we drilled down from standards to indicators with some kind of theory of change? In other words, we have our standards, and here's our theory of what we're going to try to do to engage families and move the needle on student achievement, and these are the indicators we're going to track as to look at our performance to see if we're on track in the way that we hope we are. Do we have examples of people that have done that?
I think the standards that I'm referring to, such as the National PTA standards, their frame of reference is what is the role of schools. One of their frames of reference is what is the role of schools in creating environments that move forward. But they're also looking at what circumstances have to be in place in order for parents to achieve some of the perhaps qualities that Kathy Hoover Dempsey's research talks about. Feeling more efficacious, more. I can't say that. Somebody say efficacy. Thank you. Helping parents feel like they are able to be partners with teachers. So those kinds of attitudes and feelings. I think that they're all related, but I don't think, at least to my knowledge, I don't think that there is a silver bullet kind of measure that says if you do this, then you will automatically raise the needle on student achievement. I think that's not possible at this point, because we're really dealing with complex family systems. We're dealing with students over time, dealing with a myriad of inputs into that student's level. That student's life, and right. The family is an important one. We recognize that. Right. School is important.
I think one of the things I would bring into the conversation is that I think some of the most important work has been done by actually Tony Breik and his colleagues in their work on lessons from Chicago school reform, and they talk about 5 critical ingredients for kids to succeed in high poverty, or that predicted kids that succeeded in high poverty schools in Chicago. And it ties together, I think, much of our conversation in the following way. What Tony and his colleagues did is look at the school as an organization, not just teachers or students or families, but the school as an organization, and say, what did that school have in place that enabled, in very high poverty neighborhoods with high poverty kids, some schools to significantly move the needle on math and literacy, and what was absent in places where that didn't happen. And they had a pathway model. So they had 5 key ingredients: principal leadership, good curriculum, good professional development for the teachers, a climate, an overall school climate that supported learning, and critically important, family and community engagement. And in their analysis, what they found was things like a pathway whereby schools that had more family and community engagement had higher attendance, which meant that the teacher didn't have to teach the half of the kids that weren't there yesterday today, and bore the ones that were there yesterday. So there was a real increase in instructional and improvement that then in turn led to higher attendance and pointed directly to those improved math and literacy outcomes. So we talked earlier in the conversation about pathways. A certain set of things take place in families and in their relationship with their kids and their relationships to school that then move along in interaction with other important variables like, the quality of teaching and learning and those kinds of things that then together through this pathway improve child outcomes. So I think in this arena, what I'm hearing in the conversation is we're moving from programs and the expectation that there's a silver bullet in family engagement to thinking about family engagement in interaction with other things that then create these pathways to improved outcomes for kids, and beginning to specify what those pathways are. And in the conversation, I heard a number of elements of the pathways and the notion that we're not going to have quick fixes. We're going to set a set of processes in motion in interactions amongst the key players in terms of their relationships, supported by an organization, for example, a school, that puts some of those critical ingredients together, and that mix of ingredients then leads to better outcomes for kids. So in terms of our research designs, we're talking about I think, a more complex set of research designs potentially, but even in some of our, simpler efforts, understanding these things as pathways, and as Kathy and Eric and others have pointed out, that take time for a set of changes to take place that then contribute to better learning outcomes for kids. And I think as evaluators, beginning to think in those kinds of terms with related, theories of change will help us move our understanding in the family and community engagement field of how what we do contributes to better outcomes further along. Do other members of the panel have other sort of wrap-up thoughts they would like to contribute based on the conversation that we've had?
Heather, I would just say, this is Kathy, your articulation in the last couple of minutes was a brilliant summary of many of the critical points here, I think.
Thank you. Other beyond that, other thoughts, other brilliant thoughts.
Sorry, you really got several good points.
Well, I think returning to where Amy led us off with, and thinking about the context where families are and aren't getting engaged, and combining that with your Heather, you drawing out Tony Brike's work on how context in schools and districts and families are interacting with engagement, and considering the complexity of that and what would be reasonable to expect out of any engagement intervention, I think is an important consideration.
And this is Kate, and I appreciate that the study that Heather had mentioned, concerning the interaction between those focuses, and I appreciate it in part because it didn't try to separate out family engagement. It acknowledged that families are important to their kids' education, almost as an ancient truth, and then it went beyond that to try to isolate some of the some of those indicators, some of those ways that it contributes to the whole. So I think that our challenge for many of us who are not in academic situations, the challenge is not so much to do studies, but the challenge is to choose wisely and to look at the range of options out there in terms of resources and comprehensive programs for family engagement, and build your evaluation around those kinds of programs that appear to be solidly linked to the kinds of outcomes that you are going to be working towards, and moving from that point.
This is Amy. I would just like to, echo what we said earlier about the importance of involving parents and youth, both in the actual data collection, but I would extend that even to say having them be key informants in the development of the intervention being evaluated itself, because that will help us, I think, as we design the evaluation and think forward, do some sort of backwards planning. It will help us having their input at that early intervention development stage to be more aware of what we need to look for in the outcome stage.
Becca, do you have any additional thoughts?
I think they've been pretty well covered. So,
okay, I want to close by reminding people that you will find a set of post-webinar resources on our and on the webinar website, probably Monday or Tuesday of next week. And we think of it as the stone in the stone soup. Here's a set of initial resources. We're hoping everybody in the webinar audience that knows of examples of evaluation, relevant tools, etc., will contribute to them. And over the next year, HFRP and others will be trying to put together a mass of tools to help us make progress around evaluation in the family engagement arena. So please, evaluation is very important to family engagement moving forward. We need to work together to build our collective capacity to do it and share what we've got. And this webinar is an example of that. And I think the kind of stone soup of resources to which we hope to add a whole lot of vegetables and meat in the next year will help as well. So beginning to link together to share across our work, I think is going to be important in this, particularly at a time when resources are scarce. I'd like to thank our experts, Becca and Eric and Kate and Amy and Kathy, for your expertise and sharing it in the webinar. And I'd like to thank everybody, our partners, United Way, the PTA, CEDL, for our continuing work together on the webinar series. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody, in addition to the Department of Ed, by the way, whose sponsorship has been critical. And I'd like to thank everybody who participated in the audience.